On Sophia's 10th birthday, the house smelled like vanilla frosting and melted candles. Balloons brushed the ceiling and laughter bounced off the walls as kids played. Kids chased each other between the living room and the backyard with joy. I remember thinking how rare it was to have a peaceful day with Carmen present. She sat stiffly on the couch, hands folded around a neatly wrapped box. She watched everything with a thin smile that seemed out of place. When it was time for gifts, Sophia climbed onto the rug, eyes shining bright. She saved her grandmother's present for last because she'd been taught manners. The paper was pale blue, tied with a silver ribbon that sparkled. When she opened it, there was a small cosmetic kit inside, bright and colorful. It was the kind marketed to kids as fun makeup for playtime. Before I could ask what it was, Sophia gasped and rubbed her eyes hard. She blinked rapidly, then screamed in a way I had never heard before. Pure panic ripped through her voice, filling the room with terror. "Mom, my eyes. I can't see anything." She clawed at her face, tears streaming down as she knocked the box over. My husband Adrian rushed to her, lifting her gently in his strong arms. The room froze instantly and all the kids went completely silent in shock. Carmen stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly across the floor. Sophia kept crying that everything was dark and that it burned so much. Adrian didn't ask questions as he grabbed the car keys and headed out. Our daughter pressed against his chest, still screaming in pain and fear. I stood there shaking, staring at the spilled contents of the mysterious gift. Tiny bottles with glittery labels released a sharp and alarming chemical smell. Carmen muttered that it must be an allergy to something in the kit. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I realized this was wrong. This wasn't an allergy. This was something far more sinister and deliberate. When they left, I locked myself in the bathroom and broke down in tears. I replayed the moment again and again, unable to erase it from my mind. I kept seeing Sophia's small hands desperately covering her eyes in agony. I didn't know yet that this birthday would split our family in two forever. The hours crawled by like years while I waited anxiously for any news. I cleaned up the party without really seeing what I was doing at all. I answered worried messages from parents who had heard something terrible happened. My phone finally rang close to midnight, breaking the heavy silence. It was Adrian, his voice flat and distant on the other end of the line. He said doctors were running tests and our daughter's eyes were irritated badly. They were maybe burned by something and he wouldn't say anything more. I asked if she could see and there was a pause that lasted too long. "Too long," he said finally. "Not yet. The doctors are still checking." After I hung up, I went back to the living room and stared at the box. I put on gloves and carefully gathered everything into a large plastic bag. The labels were in tiny print from foreign brands I didn't recognize at all. One bottle had no label at all, making it even more suspicious and dangerous. The smell made my eyes sting just from being close to the open bag. I thought of Carmen and how she'd insisted on picking the gift herself. She had made comments before about kids being too sensitive these days. Memories stacked up ugly and sharp as I tried to make sense of it. When morning came, Adrian returned home alone, looking pale and exhausted. He didn't meet my eyes as he walked slowly through the front door. He said the doctors believed a chemical had gotten into Sophia's eyes. Something strong enough to temporarily blind her and cause severe damage. They were keeping her overnight for more tests and close observation. I demanded to know how that could possibly happen from a children's toy. He finally looked at the bag on the table and his face went pale. He asked where I got it and I told him it was from Carmen. He took a long breath and said he needed to step outside for air. When he came back, he wasn't alone as two police officers followed him. The sight of them in our house made my knees weak with dread. They asked about the gift, about Carmen, and about everything I had seen. Adrian stood there like a stranger, unable to look at me directly. In that moment, I realized this was much bigger than a simple accident. The officers photographed the gift and sealed it carefully as evidence. They asked if my mother-in-law Carmen had a history of conflicts with me. I answered carefully, my voice shaking as I spoke the painful truth. Yes, we'd argued many times. Yes, she'd said cruel things in the past. No, I never believed she would hurt a child no matter what. When they left, Adrian finally spoke, breaking the tense and heavy silence. He said the hospital had called the police because the injury didn't look accidental. A toxicology test suggested industrial-grade chemicals, not ordinary children's makeup. I felt sick hearing the confirmation of what I had feared all along. He said his mother had been questioned at the hospital and contradicted herself. She couldn't explain clearly where she had bought the so-called gift. He told me the police would likely arrest her for what she had done. I expected him to be furious, but instead he looked completely broken. I drove to the hospital and sat beside Sophia's bed holding her hand. I watched the bandages over her eyes rise and fall with each breath. She asked me in a small voice if she'd ever see again one day. Yes, of course. Inside my heart was screaming with fear and unbearable pain. Doctors explained that the damage might heal over time, but there were no guarantees. They asked if anyone could have done this intentionally to harm her. I thought of Carmen's tight, thin smile at the birthday party. When the police called later to say she'd been taken into custody, I felt no relief, only a profound sense of grief for everyone involved. This wasn't justice yet. It was only the beginning of something much darker. News travels fast in small circles, and soon everyone knew something was wrong. By the second day, relatives were calling, some offering support, others accusing. Some accused me of exaggerating the whole situation for attention or revenge. Carmen's sister left a voicemail saying I'd always hated her and her family. She claimed I had finally found a way to destroy the entire family. Adrian withdrew into himself, spending hours on the phone with lawyers and detectives. When he spoke to me, it was stiff, careful, and full of tension. He chose every word carefully so it wouldn't explode the situation further. The police discovered receipts showing Carmen had purchased cleaning solvents weeks earlier. Surveillance footage placed her in a store buying empty cosmetic containers. The story became clear and horrifying as the pieces all fell into place. She'd planned it deliberately. Why was something harder to fully understand? The psychologist assigned to Sophia said words that felt like a knife to me. Sometimes grandparents project resentment onto grandchildren when they see them as extensions of a disliked parent. That sentence cut deep into my soul and made me question everything. At night I lay awake listening to Adrian pace back and forth in worry. I wondered if our marriage could survive this devastating betrayal and pain. When he finally sat beside me, he said he believed me now completely. He believed his own mother had done this unthinkable thing to our child. I didn't feel victorious or happy. I felt hollow and deeply sad. Sophia began to see shadows on the third day, which was a good sign. The doctor said it was positive news and her vision might return gradually. I cried in the hallway until my legs gave out from the overwhelming emotion. Court dates followed quickly as the legal process moved forward without delay. The prosecutor asked me to testify about our difficult relationship with Carmen. I spoke about past threats that had been disguised as harmless jokes. Sitting on the witness stand, I felt exposed and vulnerable to the world. Every private family argument had been dragged out into bright fluorescent light. Carmen stared at me across the courtroom with eyes full of rage, not remorse. She claimed it was all an accident, that she'd simply mixed things up. She insisted she only wanted to give something special to her granddaughter. The jury saw through her lies because the chemical analysis didn't lie at all. Sophia wore dark glasses and held my hand tightly when she testified via video. She described the burning pain and the overwhelming fear she had experienced. I watched as several jurors wiped their eyes while listening to her story. Adrian testified too, his voice cracking as he admitted ignoring warning signs for years. When the verdict came back guilty, the entire room seemed to exhale at once. She was sentenced to prison for the crime she had committed against Sophia. As she was led away in handcuffs, she shouted that this wasn't over yet. I believed her threat and knew this nightmare might not be fully behind us. Life after the trial was quieter, but the weight on our hearts was heavier. Sophia's vision slowly improved over time, though she would always have sensitivity to light. Birthdays became small, quiet affairs instead of big celebrations with many guests. Trust felt fragile and something we had to rebuild carefully every single day. Adrian and I went to counseling, trying to stitch our marriage back together. We worked hard to repair something that had been violently ripped open. Sometimes he'd wake up in the middle of the night crying from the pain. He was grieving the mother he thought he had known all his life. I grieved too for the grandmother that Sophia lost and the innocence stolen from her. One evening a letter arrived from the prison addressed to our family. Adrian read it quietly and then tore it up into small pieces. He said it was full of blame and excuses with no real apology. That was the moment he finally let go of any remaining connection to her. Years passed and Sophia grew stronger, braver, and more determined than ever. She learned to tell her story without her voice shaking from fear. She said she wanted to help other kids who had been hurt by family members. Watching her speak at a school assembly, I felt immense pride swell in my chest. The scars from that day were there, but they no longer defined who she was. Sometimes people asked how I could possibly forgive such a terrible act. I told them honestly that I didn't. Forgiveness wasn't the goal I sought. Safety was. Truth was. Peace was what we needed to move forward. On her 15th birthday, Sophia blew out her candles with a bright smile. She opened a simple gift she had chosen especially for me that day. It was a delicate necklace with a tiny eye charm hanging from it. She smiled and said it reminded her to always see clearly in life. Not just with her eyes, but with wisdom and an open heart as well. I hugged her tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of cake and candles. The past was still part of us, but it no longer owned or controlled us. That day I understood that what happened after the police arrived wasn't just justice. It was survival and the start of a new chapter filled with hope and strength. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. See you in the next story.